A patient lies anesthetized on the operating table at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. The year is 1991, and what is about to occur will become one of the most striking documented cases in the medical literature on near-death experiences. Her name is Pam Reynolds, a 35-year-old singer-songwriter who has been diagnosed with a giant aneurysm at the base of her brain, a condition that without intervention will kill her, but that conventional surgery cannot reach. The surgical team, led by Dr. Robert Spetzler, will use a procedure called hypothermic cardiac arrest, sometimes called standstill. Her body temperature will be deliberately lowered to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Her heart will be stopped completely. The blood will be drained entirely from her head. Her brain will produce no measurable electrical activity. By every clinical measure that contemporary medicine can apply, she will be dead flat, EEG, flat brainstem responses, no cerebral blood flow whatsoever, no detectable activity in any part of her central nervous system. The surgical team will then have approximately 1 hour to operate on her brain before they restart her circulation and warm her body back to life. The procedure proceeds with careful and continuous attention to monitoring. Pam is anesthetized. Her eyes are taped shut. Small molded speakers are placed in her ears, emitting clicks at 100 decibels louder than the noise of a chainsaw to monitor her brainstem. Auditory evoked response. Her body temperature gradually drops. The cardiac standstill begins. The EEG monitor falls completely silent. Her brain shows no activity that any contemporary instrument can detect. The blood is drained from her brain. The surgery on the aneurysm proceeds. Hours later, after the aneurysm has been successfully clipped and Pam has been warmed and revived, she begins to describe what happened during the surgery. She describes the bone saw the surgeons used, a saw she had never seen, that was kept in a case she could not have observed. She describes its shape and design, comparing it to an electric toothbrush, with interchangeable bits stored in what she said looked like a socket wrench case. She describes a conversation among the surgical team, specifically about the size of her arteries, a conversation that occurred while her eyes were taped shut. Her ears were filled with 100 decibel clicks, and her brain was registering no activity. She describes seeing her own body from outside it, observing the surgical procedure from above, encountering deceased relatives in what she described as a place of overwhelming light, and being told by these encountered figures that it was not yet her time to remain there permanently. Every detail that Pam reported about the surgical instruments and the conversation among the team was subsequently independently verified against the surgical records and the surgeon's recollections. The verifications obtained were not approximate. They were exact, including specific details about the bone, saw that no patient could plausibly have learnt about through any ordinary sensory channels. The case was investigated by Dr. Michael Sabum, a cardiologist who had spent decades documenting near-death experiences with the same methodological rigor that he would have applied to any other clinical phenomenon under medical investigation. Sabum's account, published in his 1998 book Light and Death, remains one of the most thoroughly documented cases in the literature. Sabum himself had begun his investigation of near-death experiences as a skeptic, intending to prove that the reports were physiologically explicable. His earlier book, Recollections of Death, published in 1982, had documented his initial findings. By the time he investigated Pam Reynolds, more than a decade of clinical research had convinced him that something genuinely unusual was occurring in these cases. But the Reynolds case provided evidential weight that he had not previously encountered. The combination of documented brain death conditions, surgical details that the patient could not have known through normal channels, and the clarity of her report set the case apart even among the well-documented cases he had previously studied. The Pam Reynolds case is not unique. It is unusually well documented, because of the specific medical procedure that allowed researchers to know exactly when her brain was registering no activity. But cases with similar evidential features have accumulated steadily across decades of careful research conducted at major medical centers around the world. Patients have consistently reported experiences from periods when their hearts had stopped, their breathing had ceased, and their brains had shown no measurable electrical activity on continuous monitoring equipment. The experiences have included observations of events occurring around their unconscious bodies, encounters with deceased individuals whom the patients did not know had died, detailed perceptions of events occurring at distant locations that the patients had no normal sensory way to access, and remarkably consistent reports of experiences whose phenomenological structure converges across cultures, across ages from young children to elderly patients, and across the full range of prior religious commitments and lack of religious commitments. The most widely cited modern study of this phenomenon was conducted by the Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel and his collaborators. He was published in the Lancet in December 2001, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. Van Lommel and his team studied 344 cardiac arrest survivors across 10 Dutch hospitals, conducting structured interviews within days of resuscitation. 18% of the survivors reported what the researchers categorized as a near-death experience. The percentage was striking, but more striking was what the experiences contained. Van Lommel documented patients reporting expanded awareness, encounters with deceased relatives, life review, perceptions of light, sensations of profound peace and unconditional love, and in some cases detailed observations of medical procedures occurring around their unconscious bodies. The experiences were reported by patients across the full age range, across various cultural and religious backgrounds, and across different types of cardiac arrest. The patients who reported these experiences could not be distinguished from those who did not, on the basis of demographic factors, prior religious commitment, or the specific medical circumstances of their cardiac arrest. Something was happening that the patients consistently reported as more vivid and more real than ordinary waking consciousness, and it was happening during periods when conventional neuroscience would predict that no conscious experience whatsoever should be possible. Van Lommel's published study carefully addressed the obvious skeptical alternative explanations. The patients were not confabulating recent memories from periods before or after the cardiac arrest. The experiences were not adequately explained by oxygen deprivation, since prolonged oxygen deprivation typically produces confused or absent memories rather than the unusually clear, vivid, and structured reports that the cardiac arrest patients gave. The experiences were not explained by medication effects, since they occurred across patients who were receiving different medications and dosages. They were not explained by religious expectations, since they occurred in patients with no prior religious framework as readily as in patients with strong religious commitments, and their phenomenological structure was similar across these very different populations. Van Lommel's prospective methodology was particularly important. Rather than collecting reports from people who claim to have had near-death experiences and then investigating their cases, Van Lommel and his team interviewed every cardiac arrest survivor across 10 participating hospitals during the same time period, collecting reports from those who had experiences and confirming the absence of experiences in those who did not. This prospective design eliminated selection bias that had limited earlier studies. The Lancet's editors accepted the paper for publication after rigorous peer review precisely because Van Lommel's methodology had carefully considered and ruled out the obvious alternative explanations. The work that Van Lommel began has been substantially extended through the AWARE studies led by Sam Parnia, formerly of Southampton University in the United Kingdom and now at New York University Langone Medical Center. The AWARE study, conducted from 2008 through 2014 across hospitals in the United Kingdom, Austria, and the United States, examined more than 2,000 cardiac arrest patients across the participating sites. The study included a methodological innovation specifically designed to test claims of out-of-body perception during cardiac arrest. Hidden visual targets were placed in the upper rooms of cardiac care units, visible only from positions above the room, positions that patients lying unconscious on examination tables could not normally see. The targets were placed without the medical staff knowing what specific images had been chosen. The Aware Eye study had limited power to test the hidden target hypothesis directly, because most cardiac arrests in the studied wards did not occur in rooms that contained the targets, and most patients who experienced cardiac arrest did not survive to be interviewed. But the study did document substantial reports of conscious awareness during cardiac arrest, with some patients providing accurate accounts of events that occurred during the periods when their EEGs would have been flat. One Aware Eye patient, a 57-year-old man, accurately described events that occurred during his cardiac arrest in detail that included specific medical interventions, conversations among the staff, and equipment used during his resuscitation, all from a vantage point that suggested out-of-body observation. The verifiable elements of his account were confirmed against medical records and staff recollections. The follow-up Aware 2 study, conducted from 2014 through 2020, expanded the methodology and continues to provide accumulating data. Parnia's work, summarized in his books What Happens When We Die and Erasing Death, presents perhaps the most comprehensive contemporary research program on consciousness during cardiac arrest. Bruce Greyson, the Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia, who joined the Division of Perceptual Studies, originally founded by Ian Stevenson, and who has spent more than 50 years researching near-death experiences with rigorous clinical methodology, and who has spent more than 50 years researching near-death experiences, has documented the phenomenon across thousands of cases. Greyson has served as longtime editor of the Journal of Near-Death Studies and has been a central figure in establishing the academic and clinical legitimacy of the field of near-death studies within mainstream medicine and psychology. His book After, published in 2021, summarizes the accumulated findings of his decades-long research career. Greyson developed the Greyson NDE scale in 1983, the standard instrument used across the field to identify and measure near-death experiences. The Greyson scale, validated across thousands of cases since its publication in 1983, has become the gold standard instrument for identifying near-death experiences in research contexts. The scale identifies 16 specific elements, including encounters with deceased persons, perceptions of an unearthly realm, sensations of joy or peace, time distortion, sense of altered understanding, accelerated thoughts, life review, sense of being out of the body, and other features that appear consistently across the reports patients provide. The convergent features of near-death experiences across cultures and individuals deserve careful attention. Kenneth Ring, the psychologist whose 1,980 book Life at Death was among the first systematic empirical studies of the phenomenon, identified what he called the core experience features, appearing consistently across cases, regardless of cultural background. Ring developed his framework while serving as a professor at the University of Connecticut, building on the earlier work of Raymond Moody, whose 1,975 book, Life After Life, had brought near-death experiences to widespread public attention by collecting and analyzing reports from people who had been clinically dead before being resuscitated. Ring's substantial later work, particularly his 1,998 book, Lessons from the Light, documented that congenitally blind individuals who had near-death experiences reported visual perception during the experiences, with some patients accurately describing visual details of their surroundings during the experiences despite having been completely blind from birth and never having had any visual experience throughout their embodied lives. The phenomenon, if accurately reported, suggests that the perception during near-death experiences is not produced by the visual cortex in the conventional way. Since the visual cortex of congenitally blind individuals has not developed the typical capacities for visual perception and could not produce visual hallucinations of the kind these patients reported, the structure that emerges from the substantial accumulated research over the past 50 years includes several recurring features that have been documented across thousands of cases. Patients commonly report a profound sense of separation from the body, often described in terms of observing the body from above or from another vantage point in the room where the body lies. They report passage through a tunnel or region of darkness toward a region of overwhelming light. They report meetings with deceased relatives or with other beings, sometimes identified by the patient as religious figures associated with their cultural and religious background. They report sustained sensations of overwhelming peace, joy, or unconditional love, far exceeding any emotional experience normally available in ordinary embodied life. They report a life review in which significant events of their entire life are experienced again, often with full awareness of how those events affected others around them. They report encountering a boundary or threshold beyond which they sense intuitively they cannot return to embodied life if they cross it. They report being sent back to embodied life, sometimes against their stated preference, with the explanation given to them that their work in the embodied life is not yet complete. The accumulated scientific literature includes substantial documentation of these cases across multiple decades. Carlis Osis and Erlendur Haraldsson, working at the American Society for Psychical Research in New York and at the University of Iceland, respectively, conducted cross-cultural studies of deathbed experiences across India and the United States, documenting remarkably consistent features in their 1977 book, At the Hour of Death, which compared the deathbed experiences of patients across these widely different cultural contexts. The cross-cultural consistency they documented helped establish definitively that the phenomena were not produced merely by particular cultural expectations, but appeared in remarkably similar phenomenological form across radically different cultural and religious contexts. The most striking cases include verifiable elements that have been independently corroborated. Patients have described conversations among the medical staff that occurred while they were clinically dead. Patients have described accurate details of medical procedures performed on their unconscious bodies, the specific instruments used, the conversations among medical staff, the entries and exits of personnel from the room, the order in which interventions were performed. Patients have encountered, during their experiences, deceased relatives whose deaths they had not yet been informed of through normal channels, with the previously unknown deaths being subsequently confirmed against family records. In some documented cases, patients have brought back information from these encounters that subsequently proved accurate against external verification. The cases that include verifiable evidential elements are not numerous in proportion to the total number of near-death experiences reported, but they exist in sufficient quantity and quality to constitute a substantial body of evidence that requires careful explanation rather than simple dismissal. The Pam Reynolds case is one detailed example of this category. Another well-documented case involves Maria, a patient in a Seattle hospital who had a cardiac arrest and was resuscitated. During her experience, she reported leaving her body and floating outside the hospital, where she observed a tennis shoe on a third-floor window ledge, a shoe she described in detail, including specific wear patterns, visible only from particular angles. The hospital staff initially dismissed her account, but a social worker named Kimberly Clark Sharp investigated and confirmed that the tennis shoe was indeed on the ledge, with details matching what Maria had reported. The shoe could not have been observed from inside the building or from ground level, and Maria had been unconscious during the period when she claimed to have observed it. Sharp documented the case carefully and published her account in multiple subsequent works. The case has been challenged by some skeptical investigators, but the basic facts, Maria's pre-discovery description of the shoe in detail, the subsequent verification of the shoe's existence on a ledge that could not have been observed from her hospital position, remain part of the documented record. A third case involves a woman whose near-death experience was studied by Penny Sartori, a critical care nurse at Morriston Hospital in Wales, who conducted a 5-year prospective study of cardiac arrest patients on her intensive care unit, documented these phenomena with the kind of clinical detail that bedside research can provide. The patient described a deceased relative who appeared to her during her experience, accurately conveying information about another family member's medical condition that the patient could not have known through normal channels and that subsequently proved to be accurate. In one striking case from Sartori's research, a patient in her ward described, after his cardiac arrest, having seen a male nurse in pink scrubs who had been bouncing on his bed during chest compressions, a detail confirmed by the staff that no patient in his condition could have observed through normal channels. Sartori's research, conducted across years of careful clinical observation, has documented multiple cases with similar evidential features. Her 2014 book, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, presents her accumulated findings. Howard Storm, a former art professor at Northern Kentucky University, had a near-death experience in 1985 during a perforated stomach in Paris that has been documented across his subsequent writings. Storm's case is unusual because his experience included what he described as a frightening initial phase before the more typical features of light, peace, and encounter with deceased relatives emerged. Storm's account, presented in his 2005 book, My Descent into Death, documents that near-death experiences are not uniformly pleasant. Some patients report initially distressing experiences that subsequent research has documented in approximately 10 to 20% of cases, depending on how the distress is measured. Eben Alexander provides perhaps the most provocative case from the perspective of conventional neuroscience. Alexander was an academic neurosurgeon at Harvard Medical School, with 25 years of clinical and research experience, who had been previously skeptical of near-death experience reports. In November 2008, he contracted a severe case of bacterial meningitis caused by E. coli, a condition that, in adults, has a mortality rate of approximately 90% and that almost invariably destroys neocortical function. Alexander spent 7 days in a coma, with his neocortex showing minimal to no activity throughout the period. The medical team had begun discussing withdrawal of care. He recovered unexpectedly, against medical predictions, and reported during his recovery an extraordinarily detailed near-death experience that he subsequently documented in his 2012 book, Proof of Heaven, which became an international bestseller. What makes Alexander's case particularly significant is the combination of his professional credentials, the documented severity of his neurological condition, and the specific nature of what he reported. Alexander was qualified to evaluate his own brain imaging and medical records, and he was emphatic in his published account that his neocortex was not functioning during the period when he had his experience. The conventional explanation for near-death experiences as products of compromised but still functional brain activity, Alexander argued, did not apply to his case, since his brain had been documented as not functional in the relevant senses during the period in question. Alexander provided his name and his case publicly precisely because he understood that his professional credentials as a Harvard neurosurgeon would be subjected to scrutiny. His account included detailed medical documentation, including imaging studies and physician notes from his hospitalization at Lynchburg General Hospital in Virginia. The Alexander case has been criticized by some neuroscientists who have proposed alternative readings of his medical records, But the basic facts of his case, the severity of the meningitis, the duration of the coma, the detail of his report remain striking regardless of how one interprets the implications. The pediatric cases provide another important line of evidence. Children's near-death experiences have been studied by researchers including Melvin Morse, whose books, Closer to the Light and Transformed by the Light, document cases of children who had cardiac arrests or other near-death events, and who reported experiences with the same structural features as adult experiences. The children, particularly very young children, would have had limited cultural conditioning to produce such reports, yet the reports converge in striking detail with what adults describe. Morse documented one case of a 3-year-old who had been resuscitated after nearly drowning in a swimming pool. After her recovery, she spontaneously described having met her mother's deceased grandfather during her experience, a great-grandfather she had never met in life and had not been told about. The family verified that the great-grandfather she described, with details about his appearance and personality, matched the deceased relative she could not have known about through ordinary channels. Children have described meeting deceased grandparents whom they had never met in life, encountering religious figures appropriate to their cultural background but with details they had not been taught, and undergoing the same kind of life review that adults report despite having limited biographical material to review. PMH. Atwater, who had her own near-death experiences and subsequently conducted decades of research on the phenomenon, has documented thousands of cases, including extensive work on pediatric near-death experiences. Her books, including Coming Back to Life and Children of the New Millennium, have presented case material that complements the more academic studies. Cherie Sutherland's research on Australian children who had near-death experiences provides additional documentation. Her 1995 book, Children of the Light, presents detailed cases of pediatric near-death experiences, including young children who reported experiences with the same core features: separation from the body, encounters with deceased relatives, perception of overwhelming light, sensations of love and peace that adult patients report. The transformations that follow near-death experiences provide additional evidence worth attention. Research conducted across multiple decades has documented that people who have had near-death experiences typically report substantial changes in their values, priorities, and orientation to life. They report decreased fear of death, increased compassion, decreased materialism, increased interest in spiritual or contemplative dimensions of life, and a sustained sense that something substantially larger has been encountered that gives meaning to ordinary existence in ways it did not seem to have before the experience. These transformations have been documented through longitudinal studies that track patients over years and decades following their experiences. Grayson and his colleagues have published extensively on the aftereffects, with consistent findings across studies that the changes are sustained and substantial. Marriages and careers sometimes change as a result of these experiences. Patterns of personal relationship and patterns of meaning-making frequently change in fundamental ways. The patient who returns from a near-death experience is, by their own consistent report and the consistent observations of those around them, not the same person who left. The transformations are not the kind of effect that hallucination or confabulation typically produces. Hallucinations are generally remembered, when they are remembered at all, as confused or fragmentary experiences that fade with time. Near-death experiences, by contrast, are remembered as more vivid than ordinary memory, and they produce sustained changes in how people subsequently live their lives. The phenomenon is doing something that ordinary altered states of consciousness do not do. The convergence across pediatric and adult experiences, across cultures, and across the prior beliefs of patients argues that something consistent is being encountered during near-death experiences, regardless of how that something is ultimately interpreted. The accumulated evidence across these multiple lines of investigation, prospective cardiac arrest studies, pediatric cases, cross-cultural comparison, transformative after effects, verifiable veridical perception during clinically documented unconsciousness is substantial enough that the dismissive treatment of near-death experiences as hallucinations or confabulations is no longer adequate to the data. Something is occurring during cardiac arrest and other near-death conditions that includes, in some cases, accurate perception of events that the patient could not have observed through any normal sensory channels. Something includes encounters with realities that patients consistently describe as more real, more vivid, and more meaningful than ordinary waking experience. Something includes the consistent phenomenological features that have been documented across cultures, ages, and prior beliefs. Whatever this something is that occurs in these episodes, the conventional materialist account that treats consciousness as entirely produced by ongoing brain activity has substantial difficulty accommodating the accumulated data. The data does not require us to accept any particular religious or theological account. The data does require us to take seriously that the production framework, which has worked well for many other neurological phenomena, fails for the particular class of phenomena that occurs around the threshold of clinical death. The question that emerges is what theoretical frameworks might handle the evidence better. The conventional account predicts that consciousness ceases when brain activity ceases. The data shows that something that patients describe as more vivid and more real than ordinary consciousness occurs during periods when brain activity has, in many documented cases, ceased to a degree that the conventional account does not allow for. Either the conventional account is missing something about how brain activity relates to consciousness, or the consciousness that operates during these episodes is not entirely dependent on the brain in the way the conventional account assumes. The frameworks that handle the evidence better turn out to be ones that the contemplative traditions across cultures have been articulating for thousands of years, joined by contemporary scientific frameworks that align with the traditional accounts in ways that deserve careful examination. What the contemplative traditions across cultures have been articulating for thousands of years about the soul's experience at the threshold of biological death has, on the available accumulated evidence, substantially more empirical support than contemporary materialist culture typically recognizes. The traditions of Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and the indigenous frameworks across the world have been describing the soul's experience at the threshold of biological death across thousands of years, with detailed accounts that include features the contemporary research is now documenting. The Tibetan Buddhist Bardo Thodol describes a sequence of experiences after death that includes the separation from the body, encounters with deceased relatives, perceptions of light, and judgment scenes that match in remarkable detail what contemporary near-death experience patients report. The Christian eschatological tradition, drawing on biblical sources including Paul's account in 2 Corinthians of being caught up to the third heaven, describes the soul's encounter with divine reality at the threshold of death in ways that converge with what patients describe. The investigation that follows turns to the deeper theoretical territory, where contemporary physics, philosophy of mind, and contemplative tradition all converge on a picture of consciousness that the conventional account has missed. The picture that emerges is genuinely consequential for how you understand your own existence, what you should expect at the end of your embodied life, and how you should live the time given to you between the threshold at which your body began and the threshold at which it will eventually fail. The framework that emerges does not require religious commitment to be taken seriously. It requires only that you take seriously the substantial data that has been accumulating from clinical research at major medical centers, conducted by physicians, psychologists, and other clinicians with substantial professional reputations to protect, and published in peer-reviewed journals that include some of the most prestigious in contemporary medicine. The data accumulated from clinical research on near-death experiences requires explanation. Patients across multiple decades of clinical research are reporting vivid, structured, transformative experiences during periods when their brains are documented as registering minimal or no electrical activity on continuous monitoring equipment. Some of these reports include verifiable elements that the patients could not have observed through any ordinary sensory channels available to their bodies. The conventional materialist account that treats consciousness as entirely produced by ongoing brain activity predicts that no such experiences should be possible during periods of documented brain inactivity. The accumulated clinical data shows clearly that they do occur. Either the conventional materialist account is missing something genuinely fundamental about how brain activity relates to conscious experience, or consciousness is not entirely produced by the brain in the way that the conventional account has assumed. Skeptical researchers have proposed several conventional alternative explanations that attempt to preserve the basic conventional materialist framework. Each of these alternatives deserves careful examination, because honest engagement with the territory requires understanding precisely why these explanations have not adequately handled the accumulated data. The first alternative explanation is the REM intrusion hypothesis. Kevin Nelson, a clinical neurologist at the University of Kentucky, proposed in his 2011 book, The Spiritual Doorway in the Brain, and in associated journal articles, that near-death experiences result from intrusions of REM sleep mechanisms into waking consciousness during medical crises. The specific proposal is that the brain, under conditions of severe physiological stress, activates the dream-generating mechanisms of REM sleep, producing the dreamlike features that near-death experience reports often describe. The REM intrusion hypothesis has the virtue of explaining some features of near-death experiences through known neurological mechanisms. The REM intrusion hypothesis has substantial empirical difficulties. REM intrusion phenomena typically produce fragmentary, confused, and dreamlike experiences that are remembered in the same way as dreams, vivid initially but fading rapidly, often disorganized, lacking the structured progression that near-death experience reports consistently exhibit. Near-death experiences are characteristically remembered as more vivid than ordinary memory and produce sustained life changes, neither of which features typically characterizes dream memories or REM intrusion experiences. The phenomenology is empirically wrong for the hypothesis. The persistence is empirically wrong. The transformation that follows is empirically wrong. The Grayson Group at the University of Virginia has explicitly tested the REM intrusion hypothesis against their accumulated case data. The expected correlations between REM-related features and near-death experiences did not appear in the data. Patients who reported the most vivid and structured experiences did not show the markers of REM activity that the hypothesis would predict. REM intrusion may explain some peripheral features of some cases, but it cannot account for the central features that the prospective clinical research has documented. The second alternative explanation is the cerebral hypoxia hypothesis. The proposal is that near-death experiences result from oxygen deprivation in the brain during cardiac arrest or other crises. Reduced oxygen reaching the brain produces various subjective experiences, including tunnel vision, various hallucinations, and altered conscious states. The hypothesis has been explored extensively by researchers, including the British psychologist Susan Blackmore, whose 1993 book, Dying to Live, presented the hypoxia explanation in its most developed and articulated form. The empirical difficulties confronting the hypoxia hypothesis are substantial. Patients with documented severe hypoxia typically experience confusion, agitation, and incomplete or fragmentary memories afterward, rather than the structured, vivid, lucid reports that near-death experiences include. Military pilots experiencing controlled hypoxia in altitude chambers consistently report disorientation and confused awareness, rather than the kind of expanded, lucid, and structured awareness that near-death patients consistently describe. Most fundamentally, the prospective clinical studies have measured oxygen levels in cardiac arrest patients during resuscitation and have found no correlation between the degree of oxygen deprivation and the occurrence or content of near-death experiences. Some patients with documented severe hypoxia report no near-death experiences whatsoever. Some patients with relatively brief and mild hypoxia nonetheless report extensive vivid experiences. Van Lommel addressed the hypoxia hypothesis directly in his Lancet study. The blood oxygen levels of his cardiac arrest patients were measured during resuscitation. The patients who reported near-death experiences did not have lower oxygen levels than the patients who did not report experiences. If hypoxia caused near-death experiences, the patients with the most severe hypoxia should have had the most extensive experiences. The actual correlation was absent. The data does not support the simple correlation that the hypothesis would predict. The third major alternative explanation is the endogenous DMT hypothesis. The proposal is that the dying brain releases large quantities of dimethyltryptamine, a powerful endogenous psychedelic compound, producing the hallucinatory experiences that patients report. The DMT hypothesis has been associated particularly with the work of Rick Strassman, the New Mexico psychiatrist whose 2001 book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, documented his pioneering clinical research on the compound conducted at the University of New Mexico in the 1990s. Strassman noted some interesting phenomenological similarities between DMT experiences and near-death experiences, leading to widespread speculation that the dying brain might produce a flood of DMT that explains the near-death phenomenology. The DMT hypothesis has its own significant difficulties. The actual presence of meaningful quantities of endogenous DMT in dying human brains has not been demonstrated empirically through any direct measurement. The detected baseline levels of DMT in the brain are far below what would be required to produce the kind of overwhelming subjective experience that high-dose DMT administration produces in laboratory settings. A 2022 study by Christopher Timmerman at Imperial College London compared the phenomenology of DMT experiences to near-death experience reports systematically, finding that while there were substantial similarities, there were also substantial differences. The phenomenological similarities between DMT and near-death experiences, while real, do not establish that DMT causes near-death experiences. They could equally suggest that DMT happens to provide access to some of the same dimensions of consciousness that near-death experiences access, with the underlying reality of what is being accessed being something other than the chemical compound itself. Strassman himself, in his subsequent published work, has explored the possibility that DMT functions as a key that unlocks doors to genuine non-ordinary realities rather than merely producing hallucinatory simulations of such realities. One particular feature of near-death experiences poses the most serious challenge to all the conventional explanations. The veridical perception cases in which patients accurately report events that occurred during periods of documented unconsciousness cannot be explained by REM intrusion, hypoxia, DMT release, or cultural conditioning. None of these mechanisms could produce accurate perception of events occurring outside the body during periods when the body's sensory channels were not functioning. The verifiable details that patients sometimes report from these episodes constitute evidence that some kind of perception is occurring that the conventional account does not allow for. The fourth alternative explanation is the cultural conditioning hypothesis. The cultural conditioning proposal is that patients report near-death experiences with the features they expect because they have absorbed those features from cultural exposure, with the experiences themselves being constructed from accumulated prior expectations rather than reflecting any actual non-ordinary reality being encountered. The cultural conditioning hypothesis has surface plausibility, but it fails systematically when tested against the accumulated evidence. The cross-cultural studies conducted by Carlos Osis and Erlendur Haraldsson, and by other researchers across multiple decades, have consistently found striking similarities in near-death experiences across cultures with very different prior expectations and theological frameworks. Young children, particularly very young children with substantially limited cultural conditioning, consistently report experiences with the same core features as adults. Patients with no prior religious commitments at all report their experiences as vivid and as structured as those of patients with strong religious commitments. Most critically of all, congenitally blind patients with no prior visual experience whatsoever report visual perceptions during their experiences, an outcome that the cultural conditioning hypothesis simply cannot explain through any known mechanism. The cultural conditioning hypothesis explains some peripheral features, the specific identifications of religious figures encountered, for instance, but it cannot explain the core phenomenological structure that converges so consistently across radically different cultural contexts. The conventional alternative explanations, considered individually or together as a cumulative framework, do not adequately handle the data. Some peripheral elements of some cases can be explained through these conventional mechanisms. The core phenomena cannot. Something else is occurring in these episodes that requires a substantially different theoretical framework. The frameworks that handle the accumulated data substantially better turn out to align with what the contemplative traditions across cultures have been articulating, joined by contemporary scientific frameworks that have emerged from quantum theory and from the philosophy of mind across the past century. The filter theory of consciousness provides perhaps the clearest framework for understanding what near-death experiences might involve. The framework, developed across the foundational work of the French philosopher Henri Bergson in his 1896 book Matter and Memory, the American philosopher and psychologist William James in his important 1898 Ingersoll Lectures on Human Immortality, and the British writer Aldous Huxley in his influential 1954 book The Doors of Perception proposes that the human brain functions to filter and restrict consciousness rather than to produce it from biological processes. The fully developed adult brain progressively reduces the available consciousness down to what is necessary for biological survival in physical reality, screening out the rest from ordinary conscious awareness. On the filter framework, what occurs during near-death experiences becomes immediately intelligible in a way that the conventional production framework cannot match. As the brain fails through cardiac arrest, anesthetic standstill, severe meningitis, or other conditions that compromise its normal functioning, its filtering activity is temporarily disrupted. What had been filtered out by the normally operating brain becomes temporarily accessible to the patient's consciousness during the period of brain failure. The expanded awareness, the encounters with previously deceased relatives, the perception of overwhelming light, the sense of contact with realities more substantial than ordinary waking experience, all of these features become predictable, consequences of the filtering being temporarily lifted by the brain's failure. The dying brain on this account is not producing these experiences. The dying brain is, in its temporary failure, simply ceasing to filter them out from awareness. The filter framework receives substantial empirical support from the recent work of Robin Carhart-Harris and his collaborators at Imperial College London across the past decade. The neuroimaging studies of psychedelic experiences conducted by this research team, conducted across multiple compounds and across multiple research programs, have consistently documented that the most powerful subjective experiences correlate with reductions in brain activity rather than with increases in activity. The expanded consciousness that psychedelic compounds produce occurs precisely when the brain's normal organized activity is reduced, particularly in the default mode network. The empirical pattern fits the filter framework precisely and counterintuitively. If consciousness were produced by the brain, expanded experience should correlate with increased brain activity. The empirical observation of reduced brain activity correlating with expanded subjective experience is exactly what the filter framework predicts, and what the production framework does not predict. The implications for near-death experiences are direct. As the brain begins to fail during cardiac arrest, its filtering activity progressively decreases. Consciousness that had been filtered out becomes accessible. The patient experiences directly what the brain had been hiding from awareness throughout ordinary embodied life. The features that consistently appear across cultures, the expanded awareness, the encounters, the light, the love, the sense of having returned home, are features of consciousness that the operating brain normally screens out. Near-death experiences are not produced by dying brains generating new content. They are revealed by failing filters letting through what had always been there. This filter framework changes substantially how we should understand the conventional materialist puzzle. The puzzle is not how a dying brain could somehow produce experiences more vivid than ordinary consciousness. The puzzle, properly framed, is why ordinary consciousness is so much less vivid than what becomes accessible when the brain temporarily fails. The answer the filter framework provides is that ordinary, embodied consciousness has been filtered down to what is necessary for biological survival in physical reality, with the broader reality being constantly available but normally screened out from conscious awareness. What the operating brain does, on this view, is not generate consciousness, but limit and channel it. The limiting, when partially lifted by brain failure, produces the kind of expanded experience that near-death patients consistently report. David Bohm, the American physicist, who worked alongside Einstein at Princeton in the early 1950s, and who developed his framework across decades of conversation with the philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti, articulated an implicate order framework that provides a deeper structural account of what this filtering and unfiltering might involve. Bohm proposed in his 1980 book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, that the explicate order of separate objects and sequential events that we ordinarily perceive unfolds from a deeper implicate order that contains the totality of reality in an enfolded form. The implicate order is not spatially extended in the way the explicate order is. It exists prior to and beneath the apparent separation of things in space and time as we ordinarily experience them. The brain, on this framework, participates in unfolding the explicate from the implicate, with the specific patterns of unfolding that the operating brain produces being what we experience as ordinary consciousness. When the brain fails during cardiac arrest, the unfolding it had been performing is disrupted. What had been temporarily explicate begins to return toward the implicate from which it had originally unfolded. The consciousness that had been operating through the explicate forms the brain produced has access, during the failure, to dimensions of the implicate that ordinary brain activity does not access. The patient experiences something closer to direct awareness of the implicate order itself, with the encounters and perceptions reflecting the unfolding patterns that the implicate contains. When the failing brain is subsequently restored to function, the consciousness returns to its ordinary explicate operation, but the experience of the implicate has actually occurred during the failure period and is remembered, as the patients consistently report, as more real than the explicate forms it has returned to operating within. The Bohm framework is consistent with what the contemplative traditions across cultures have been describing. The Tibetan Buddhist Bardo Thodol describes the experience immediately after death as encounter with what the tradition calls the Dharmakaya, the truth, body, the ultimate luminous reality from which all phenomenal experience unfolds and to which it ultimately returns. The Christian mystical tradition describes the soul's encounter at death with the divine ground from which all things proceed and toward which all things tend. The Sufi mystical tradition describes the encounter at death with the divine source from which the soul has been separated through its embodied existence. The vocabularies of these traditions differ substantially. The structural intuition is recognizably similar to what Bohm articulated through his physics-derived framework. The Penrose-Hameroff theory of consciousness provides another important framework relevant to understanding near-death experiences. The theory proposes that quantum processes operating in microtubules within neurons participate directly in producing conscious experience. Cellular microtubules are present throughout the body, but they are particularly concentrated in neurons and play substantial structural roles in neural function. The Penrose-Hameroff theory has received experimental support from the recent work of Anirban Bandyopadhyay and his collaborators at the National Institute of Material Sciences in Tsukuba, Japan, documenting quantum resonances in microtubule lattices under physiological conditions across multiple frequency ranges. If consciousness genuinely operates through quantum coherence processes in cellular microtubules, then the failure of normal neural electrical activity during cardiac arrest does not necessarily eliminate the substrate of conscious experience. Quantum coherence in cellular microtubules might be maintained for some period after measurable electrical activity has ceased. The conscious experience that occurs during periods of clinical death might be supported by these quantum processes that are not detectable by surface EEG monitoring, but that continue to operate during the period when conventional measurements register no activity. Stuart Hameroff has explicitly proposed in multiple subsequent publications and academic conference presentations that near-death experiences may reflect this kind of continued quantum activity, with a conscious experience persisting through quantum mechanical processes even as the classical electrical neural activity has measurably ceased. One particular line of evidence deserves attention. The Penrose-Hameroff framework receives some support from the experimental documentation of brain activity that EEG cannot detect. Jimo Borjigin and her research colleagues at the University of Michigan documented in 2013 a substantial surge of high-frequency neural activity in dying rats during the period immediately after cardiac arrest, with the surge exceeding what is typically seen during normal waking conscious activity. A subsequent 2023 follow-up study extended these findings to comatose human patients during the withdrawal of life support. The findings suggest that the dying brain may produce neural activity patterns associated with conscious processing precisely at the moment when conventional neuroscience would predict no conscious experience whatsoever. Studies using more sensitive measurement techniques, including magnetoencephalography and intracranial electrodes, have detected activity in dying brains that surface EEG monitoring did not register, suggesting that the conventional measurements may underestimate what is occurring during the period of clinical death. The presence of activity below the detection threshold of standard equipment does not rule out the occurrence of conscious experience during the periods when standard EEG shows flat readings. The Penrose-Hameroff framework would suggest that even more substantial activity at quantum scales might be continuing to operate during these periods to support the continued conscious experience that patients report. The integrated information theory developed by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin proposes that consciousness corresponds to integrated information across networks rather than to any specific neural location, with the level of consciousness determined by the degree of information integration. While the theory is not specifically a quantum framework, it has affinities with the integrated frameworks we have been considering. The neuroscientist Christophe Koch, who collaborated extensively with the late Francis Crick of DNA fame on the neural correlates of consciousness, has shifted noticeably across his career toward positions that treat consciousness as more fundamental than the conventional production account allowed. partly in response to the persistent difficulty of the hard problem. Amit Goswami's framework, articulated systematically in his 1993 book, The Self-Aware Universe, takes a different but compatible foundational approach. Goswami proposes systematically that consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative, with physical reality being patterns expressed within consciousness rather than consciousness being patterns produced by physical reality. The observer effect in quantum mechanics, on Goswami's developed framework, is direct evidence for this fundamentality of consciousness, with conscious observation playing the constitutive role that quantum experiments have consistently documented. If consciousness is genuinely fundamental rather than derivative, the failure of any particular brain does not eliminate the consciousness that has been associated with that brain. The biological brain has been functioning as the channel through which a more fundamental consciousness has expressed itself in this particular embodied form. The failure of the brain, when it occurs, does not eliminate the consciousness any more than the failure of a radio receiver eliminates the broadcast signal that the receiver had been picking up. The signal continues even when the particular receiver fails. A new receiver or a different mode of access would still detect the signal that had been there all along. The consciousness continues to exist in some form, even when the physical channel through which it had been expressing itself fails. Near-death experiences, on Goswami's framework, are direct experiences of this continuing consciousness during the period when the ordinary embodied channel is temporarily unavailable due to brain failure. The Goswami framework receives support from the broader implications of the observer effect in quantum mechanics. Eugene Wigner, the Hungarian-American mathematical physicist who shared the 1963 Nobel Prize in Physics for his contributions to atomic and elementary particle physics, argued in his influential 1961 essay, Remarks on the Mind-Body Question, that consciousness must play an active role in the collapse of quantum wave functions, since the chain of physical measurement cannot terminate in any purely physical apparatus without infinite regress. John Archibald Wheeler, the influential American theoretical physicist who coined the term black hole in 1967 and who contributed substantially to the development of quantum mechanics across the 20th century, extended this line of reasoning through his participatory anthropic principle to cosmic scales, proposing that conscious observation is constitutive of physical reality at its very foundations, rather than merely registering a reality that exists independently. If these foundational frameworks are correct, consciousness is not produced by physical reality, but is constitutive of it at the deepest level. The death of any particular biological organism does not eliminate the consciousness associated with that organism, since the consciousness was never merely a product of that biological organism. The frameworks we have considered together share a structural feature that deserves substantial attention. Each treats consciousness as something other than a mere product of localized brain activity. The filter theory treats consciousness as something the brain restricts. Bohm's implicate order treats consciousness as something that participates in a deeper unified reality from which the brain unfolds explicate forms. Penrose Hameroff treats consciousness as something supported by quantum processes that may persist beyond the cessation of classical neural activity. Goswami's framework treats consciousness as fundamental, with brains being channels through which consciousness expresses rather than produces of consciousness from nothing. The frameworks differ in their proposals about the precise mechanism, but they converge on the structural conclusion that consciousness is not exhausted by the particular brain that ordinarily channels it during embodied life. The convergence between these contemporary scientific frameworks and what the contemplative traditions across cultures have been articulating across thousands of years of accumulated investigation is striking. The contemplative traditions have consistently maintained across cultures that consciousness exists prior to and independent of the particular body, with the body being one temporary expression of something larger that exceeds it. They have consistently maintained that what the embodied condition filters or limits can become accessible at the moment of biological death. When the embodied filtering structures finally break down at the threshold of biological death, they have consistently maintained that the experience at death involves encounter with something perceived as more real than ordinary embodied experience, not less real. The contemporary clinical research is now documenting, through methodologies the traditions could not have had access to, exactly the structural features that the traditions across cultures have always described. The methodological independence of these convergent investigations across radically different methods is precisely what makes the convergence so interesting. The contemplative traditions did not develop their teachings on the basis of contemporary physics or neuroscience. The contemporary scientific frameworks did not develop on the basis of any prior religious commitment. Both bodies of investigation have arrived, working from radically different starting points and using completely different methodologies, at structurally similar conclusions about what consciousness fundamentally is and what happens at the threshold of biological death. The convergence is genuine evidence of something occurring in the territory being investigated, not absolute proof, but substantive evidence that deserves attention. The cumulative weight of these contemporary scientific frameworks, taken together with the empirical findings from the clinical research, produces an integrated picture substantially different from the conventional materialist account. Consciousness is not entirely produced by the biological brain. Some form of conscious experience continues during the periods when the brain has temporarily ceased its ordinary activity. The continuation is not characterized as a fragmentary or fading shadow of ordinary consciousness, but is consistently reported by patients as more vivid, more lucid, and more meaningful than ordinary embodied experience. What occurs during these clinical episodes deserves to be understood as access to dimensions of reality that ordinary brain activity normally screens out, with the temporarily failing brain ceasing to screen out what has always been there. The implications for what happens at the actual moment of biological death when the brain fails permanently rather than temporarily become substantial and significant. If the filter theory of consciousness is correct, the permanent failure of the brain corresponds to permanent unfiltering of consciousness. Whatever has been screened out throughout the entirety of embodied life becomes permanently accessible to the consciousness that had been embodied. If Boehm's implicate order framework is correct in its essentials, the permanent dissolution of the embodied form returns whatever consciousness had been operating through that form back to the implicate order from which it had originally unfolded. If the Penrose-Hameroff framework is correct, the quantum processes that had been supporting consciousness may continue in some form beyond the cessation of all classical neural activity. If Goswami's framework is correct, the consciousness was always fundamental and merely operated through this particular biological vehicle for a limited period of embodiment. None of these frameworks predicts that the consciousness simply ends with the body that had been carrying it. These are not merely theoretical speculations divorced from practical concern. They have direct and personal implications for how you should understand your own existence and your own eventual death. The conventional materialist account predicts that you will simply cease at the moment of biological death with whatever you have been ending entirely and not continuing in any form whatsoever. The frameworks that emerge from the convergent, traditional, and contemporary investigations predict something substantially otherwise. Something will continue beyond biological death in some form. The specific form of this continuation remains contested across the traditional and contemporary accounts, but the basic structural prediction that the cessation of brain activity does not entail the cessation of all consciousness is consistent across multiple independent lines of investigation, drawing on radically different methodologies. The contemplative traditions across cultures have not been satisfied with the structural prediction alone. They have offered substantial, detailed accounts of what occurs at the threshold of biological death, what is encountered, what choices are available to the consciousness during the transition between embodiments, and how the moral and spiritual quality of the embodied life affects what occurs after embodiment ends. The accumulated traditional accounts are, taken as a coherent whole, the most substantial body of investigation that humanity has conducted into the question of what happens at death. The contemporary clinical research is providing increasing empirical reasons to take those accounts seriously, rather than dismissing them as merely primitive cultural superstition. The investigation that emerges naturally from the integrated picture now turns to the traditions themselves, examining what the major contemplative paths across cultures have understood about the soul's experience at the threshold of biological death and beyond. The substantial depth and remarkable consistency of these accumulated accounts across cultures that historically had no contact with each other provides additional convergent evidence that something genuinely real is being investigated by the multiple traditions, with the convergent traditional reports across cultures reflecting access to actual features of the territory, rather than merely common features of universal human imagination or shared psychological tendencies inherited through evolution. The accumulated contemplative traditions across the major cultures of the world have engaged the question of what occurs at the threshold of biological death for thousands of years, before contemporary clinical research could document a single cardiac arrest case. Their detailed accounts of the soul's experience at the moment of death, the encounters that occur during the transition, and the subsequent journey of consciousness beyond the dissolved body are not vague theological speculations. They are substantively detailed frameworks developed through sustained contemplative inquiry, supported by extensive textual traditions, and refined across many generations of dedicated practitioners who took these questions with the utmost seriousness. The convergent features that emerge across these traditions deserve careful attention, particularly given how strikingly they align with what contemporary near-death experience research is now documenting empirically through methodologies completely different from anything the traditions could have employed. The Christian tradition has perhaps the most extensive theological apparatus for engaging this territory, drawing on Hebrew biblical foundations and elaborating across approximately 2,000 years of sustained theological reflection through scripture, monastic practice, and mystical writing. The Christian starting point begins with the resurrection of Jesus, which Christian theology takes as the foundational event, establishing that death is a transition rather than an extinction. The Apostle Paul, writing his second letter to the Corinthians in approximately the year 56 of the Common Era, described being caught up to the third heaven in what he called either a physical or spiritual experience he could not himself fully distinguish. The passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, provides one of the earliest first-person accounts of an extraordinary experience. At the threshold of ordinary consciousness, Paul reports hearing things that cannot be told, experiencing realities beyond ordinary capacity to describe, and returning to embodied life carrying knowledge that shaped his subsequent ministry. The Christian tradition's accumulated literature on death visions and otherworldly journeys has been studied extensively in contemporary scholarship. Carol Zaleski, professor of religion at Smith College, documented in her 1987 book, Otherworld Journeys, the consistent features of medieval Christian death visions across centuries, features that match in striking detail what contemporary near-death patients report. Medieval Christians who returned from clinical death described tunnels of light, encounters with deceased relatives, life reviews, perceptions of judgment, and decisions about return that paralleled what Aboriginal Australians, Tibetan Buddhists, and contemporary American patients in cardiac care units would also describe across centuries with no contact with each other. The Christian framework for understanding the soul's journey at death developed through multiple stages of theological reflection. The early church fathers, writing across the 2nd through 5th centuries of the Common Era, articulated detailed accounts of what occurs at the moment of death and during the period before the final resurrection. Augustine of Hippo addressed these questions extensively across his works, particularly in his work on care to be had for the dead, and in various passages of The City of God, developing accounts that carefully distinguish the immediate state of the soul after death from the final restoration that the Christian tradition expected at the end of time. The Eastern Orthodox liturgical practice continues to mark specific commemorations on the 3rd, 9th, and 40th days after death, with each milestone connected to specific traditional understandings of the soul's journey. The tradition holds that the soul is granted permission to revisit places significant to its embodied life during the 3rd day, encounters the heavenly realms during the 9th day, and undergoes its initial particular judgment on the 40th day. The Eastern Orthodox tradition developed particularly detailed teachings about the 40-day period after death, during which, on the traditional understanding, the soul undergoes a series of encounters and judgments before its initial placement in either rest or torment, awaiting the final resurrection. The Roman Catholic theological tradition developed the doctrine of the 4 last things, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, as a comprehensive framework for understanding what occurs at the end of embodied life. The particular judgment, carefully distinguished from the general judgment expected at the end of time, was understood as the immediate evaluation of the soul at the moment of death, with the soul proceeding to its appropriate state on the basis of that evaluation. The intermediate state of purgatory, systematically articulated through medieval theology and definitively confirmed at the Council of Trent in the 16th century, was understood within the tradition as a process of purification through which souls, not entirely prepared for the divine presence, could be made ready through suffering that the embodied life had not adequately accomplished during its allotted time. The Christian mystical tradition has produced detailed first-person experiential accounts that align in striking ways with contemporary near-death experience reports. Saint Faustina Kowalska, the 20th century Polish nun, whose diary became one of the most widely read mystical works in Catholic literature, described visions and experiences during her religious life that included what would now be classified as out-of-body experiences and encounters with deceased souls in various states. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, the Italian Capuchin friar canonized in 2002, he was reported by his contemporaries to have engaged in bilocation, being present simultaneously in his monastery and in distant locations where his presence was confirmed by witnesses, and to have ministered to dying souls across geographic distances. The phenomena attributed to Padre Pio remain controversial, but they were documented at the time by witnesses, including officials of the Vatican, who had no obvious motive for fraud. The Catholic Church, after extensive investigation that included detailed inquiries into the witnessed phenomena, canonized Padre Pio in 2002, with his feast day observed annually on September 23rd in the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar. The Eastern Orthodox tradition's hesychastic contemplative practice provides particularly developed accounts of the soul's experience at the boundary of biological death. The hesychast tradition, articulated systematically by St. Gregory Palamas in the 14th century and continuing through the Russian Philokalia compilation and the contemporary contemplative practice on Mount Athos, holds that sustained contemplative practice can produce experiences during embodied life that approximate in significant ways what occurs at the moment of biological death. The tradition speaks of the uncreated light, the divine glory that surrounded Christ at the Transfiguration, as a reality that practitioners can begin to perceive directly through prolonged, sustained engagement with the Jesus prayer The accumulated accounts of these perceptions in the writings of Simeon the New Theologian in the 11th century, of the Russian elders whose teachings were preserved in the way of a pilgrim, and of contemporary Athonite practitioners converge in remarkable ways with what contemporary near-death experience patients describe as their encounter with overwhelming light at the threshold of death. The biblical tradition contains additional accounts that bear directly on this territory. The raising of Lazarus by Jesus, recorded in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verses 1 through 44, established within the Christian framework that the resurrection power attributed to Jesus extends to those who have already entered the state of biological death. Lazarus had been dead 4 days, with his body already showing signs of decomposition, when Jesus called him forth from the tomb, and the Gospel account presents this miracle as the most public demonstration before the resurrection itself of authority over the threshold of biological death. The account does not describe what Lazarus experienced during his 4 days in the tomb, but Christian theological commentary across the subsequent centuries has speculated extensively about what such an after-death experience might have involved. The Buddhist tradition, particularly through its sophisticated Tibetan Vajrayana developments, has produced perhaps the most systematically detailed accounts of the soul's experience at and after biological death of any tradition in human history. The Bardo Thodol, traditionally translated as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, presents a comprehensive cartographic map of the experiences that consciousness undergoes between the moment of biological death and the next embodiment. The text was traditionally read aloud over many days to dying persons and to the deceased in the period following death, with the careful recitation understood to provide guidance to the consciousness through the Bardo states. The text was composed by Padmasambhava in the 8th century according to Tibetan tradition, then concealed and rediscovered as a terma, a hidden treasure, by Karma Lingpa in the 14th century, and has been transmitted continuously since then within the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. The Tibetan tradition has documented across many centuries the phenomenon of tukdam, the meditation of the dead, in which advanced practitioners maintain a meditative state for days or weeks after clinical death, with the body remaining warm and showing none of the typical signs of post-mortem decay. The phenomenon has been investigated more recently through studies including those conducted by Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin in collaboration with Tibetan monastic communities, with measurements documenting unusual physiological patterns in the bodies of practitioners during tukdam. The current Dalai Lama has commented extensively on the practical application of the Bardo teachings, presenting them as a comprehensive guide to the experience that consciousness undergoes between embodiments. The Tibetan Bardo framework distinguishes multiple specific stages of the after-death experience. The Chikai Bardo, the Bardo of the moment of death, involves the systematic dissolution of the elements that compose the body: earth, water, fire, air, and consciousness, with the consciousness experiencing each stage of dissolution as it occurs in sequence. As the dissolution proceeds, the dying practitioner encounters what the tradition calls the clear light of the Dharmakaya, the truth body, the ultimate reality from which all phenomenal experience unfolds. For the prepared and trained practitioner, recognition of this clear light at the moment of death produces immediate liberation, with the consciousness recognizing its own deepest nature as identical with the ultimate reality and not requiring any further cycle of embodiment. For most consciousnesses passing through the Bardo, however, the recognition does not occur or does not last long enough. The Bardo experience then proceeds onward through the Choni Bardo, the Bardo of the Dharmata, where the consciousness encounters both peaceful and wrathful deities that the Tibetan tradition understands as projections of the consciousness's own accumulated qualities, illuminated by the light of the Dharmakaya. These encounters can themselves produce liberation if recognized correctly by the consciousness, but for most consciousnesses passing through these stages, the experiences are bewildering and frightening rather than liberating. The consciousness then enters the Tibetan Bardo, the Bardo of becoming, where it begins to seek a new embodiment based on the karmic patterns it carries forward from its previous existence. The Tibetan framework teaches that the entire Bardo experience between death and rebirth typically lasts approximately 49 days, with the specific timing varying according to the karmic preparation of the individual consciousness moving through the Bardo. The convergence between the Tibetan Buddhist Bardo teachings and contemporary near-death experience clinical reports is genuinely remarkable. The dissolution of ordinary physical reality, the emergence of overwhelming light, the encounter with figures that the consciousness recognizes from its embodied life, the sense that proper recognition produces liberation, the eventual return to embodied life. All of these features appear consistently in both the traditional accounts and the contemporary clinical reports. The Tibetan tradition was not familiar with modern cardiac arrest or contemporary medical resuscitation. The contemporary cardiac arrest patients have not typically studied the Bardo Thodol before their experiences. The convergence between these accounts is occurring through complete methodological independence, which is precisely what makes the observed convergence so interesting and so resistant to dismissal. The classical Hindu philosophical tradition contains its own detailed engagement with what occurs at death, drawing on the foundational teachings of the Upanishads composed in the centuries before the Common Era and developing through the classical medical traditions of Ayurveda and the philosophical traditions of Vedanta across many subsequent centuries. The Bhagavad Gita devotes its entire 8th chapter, called the Akshara Brahma Yoga, specifically to the question of what occurs at the moment of biological death. Lord Krishna teaches Arjuna that the consciousness's state at the actual moment of death determines the nature of its next embodiment, with sustained spiritual practice across the embodied life, producing the inner conditions under which the consciousness can encounter the ultimate reality directly at the moment of death, rather than being driven by accumulated karmic patterns toward yet another birth. The Hindu philosophical framework distinguishes various intermediate states the consciousness may enter after biological death. The newly deceased consciousness, called preta in Sanskrit, is understood to spend a substantial period of time in an intermediate state before either proceeding to one of the various heavens, descending to one of the various hells, or being reborn in a new embodiment. The intermediate state is engaged through specific Shraddha rituals performed by the surviving family members, with the rituals understood to support the deceased consciousness's transition through its intermediate state. The Garuda Purana, one of the 18 major Puranas of the Hindu tradition, contains detailed accounts of what occurs during the period between death and the next embodiment, including specific descriptions of the Yamaduta, the messengers of Yama, Lord of Death, who arrive to escort the soul, the journey across the Vaitarani River, and the assessment of the soul's accumulated karma before its next placement. The traditional Hindu pilgrimage to Varanasi, Kashi, the ancient city sacred to Shiva, on the western banks of the Ganges River, has been undertaken for thousands of years specifically to die there, with the Hindu tradition holding that death in Kashi produces immediate liberation, regardless of the karmic patterns the consciousness has accumulated across its embodiments. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the foundational text of classical yoga philosophy compiled approximately 2,000 years ago, contains detailed teachings about the various states of consciousness that sustained practice can produce, operating with the implicit framework that what becomes accessible through advanced contemplative practice during embodied life is largely what becomes accessible naturally at the moment of biological death. The various samadhi states described in detail throughout the sutras involve dissolution of ordinary self-boundaries, expanded awareness, and direct contact with realities beyond the apparent separation of embodied existence, states that align in remarkable phenomenological ways with what near-death experience patients consistently describe. The Islamic tradition contains substantial, extensive teachings on what occurs at the threshold of biological death, drawing on Quranic foundations and elaborating through extensive hadith literature, sustained theological reflection, and the developed mystical traditions of Sufism. The Quran refers in multiple passages directly to the experience of dying and what follows it. Surah Al-Waqiyah, the 56th chapter of the Quran, describes the moment of death as the time when the soul, drawn out of the body, witnesses those whom the soul will meet at the threshold. Surah Al-Mulk and several other Quranic passages describe the angels who attend at the moment of death, with the angels of mercy, or alternatively, the angels of punishment approaching according to the accumulated moral and spiritual state of the soul at the moment of its departure from the body. The Quran describes additional specific features of what occurs after death. The day of resurrection, Yawm al-Qiyamah, will involve the resurrection of all bodies and a final judgment in which each soul's deeds will be weighed on the mizan, the scale of justice. The Sirat, a bridge thinner than a hair and sharper than a sword, will be traversed by every soul, with the righteous crossing easily into paradise and the unrighteous falling from it into hellfire. Before this final judgment, the Islamic tradition holds that the soul enters a state called barzakh, the intermediate world between death and the final judgment. The barzakh is understood as a real domain in which the soul has actual experiences while awaiting the final resurrection at the end of time. The Islamic tradition includes detailed accounts of the questioning of the soul in the grave by the two angels named Munkar and Nakir, who ask three foundational questions. Who is your Lord? What is your religion? Who is your prophet? The truthful answers given by the soul determine its state during the entire barzakh period, with the well-prepared righteous soul experiencing the grave as a garden of paradise, and the unprepared soul experiencing it as a prison of constraint and torment. The Miraj, the famous night journey of the Prophet Muhammad through the seven heavens recorded in Surah Al-Isra, recorded in the Hadith literature and described in remarkable detail across Islamic theological tradition, provides a foundational account of an experience at the boundary of ordinary consciousness. The Prophet, transported by the angel Gabriel, ascended through the seven heavens, encountering previous prophets at each successive level. Adam at the first heaven, Yahya and Isa at the second, Yusuf at the third, Idris at the fourth, Harun at the fifth, Musa at the sixth, and finally Ibrahim at the seventh, before approaching the divine presence beyond all of the heavens at what is called the Lot tree of the utmost boundary. The structural features of the Miraj account align in striking ways with contemporary near-death experience reports. Though the Islamic tradition treats the Miraj as a unique and unrepeatable prophetic event, rather than a generally accessible mystical experience available to ordinary believers, Sufi mystical practice across the major orders has developed sustained engagement with these themes of death and continuation across the centuries. The Andalusian master Ibn Arabi, whose influence permeates subsequent Islamic mystical thought, devoted substantial attention to the soul's experience at and after death across his massive Futuhat al-Makkiyah and several other works. The framework Ibn Arabi developed distinguishes the seven heavens, multiple intermediate worlds, and the relationship between the soul's accumulated prior states and its experience at the threshold of death. The Sufi practice of dhikr, the rhythmic remembrance of God through repetition of the 99 divine names, is understood among its other contemplative purposes as preparation for the moment of death, with the soul that has cultivated remembrance during embodied life being able to maintain remembrance during the actual transition. Jalaluddin Rumi, the 13th century Persian Sufi poet whose influence continues to shape spiritual practice across cultures, developed the famous Sufi teaching that the spiritual life involves dying before you die, undertaking through sustained contemplative practice, the dissolution of the ordinary self that occurs naturally at biological death, so that the moment of biological death itself becomes simply the natural completion of a process that the cultivated practitioner has already engaged. The Sufi teaching aligns directly with what contemporary near-death experience patients describe as the encounter with realities that the fully alive embodied person normally screens out, realities that, on the Rumi framework, the cultivated mystical practitioner can engage during the embodied life itself through the systematic loosening of ordinary self-attachment and identification. The Jewish tradition contains its own profound engagement with death, drawing on biblical foundations and elaborating through Talmudic and Kabbalistic developments. The Hebrew Bible's various references to Sheol, the realm of the dead, provide the early Jewish framework, with subsequent developments in rabbinic literature articulating the concept of Olam Haba, the world to come, that follows the present age and biological death. The Talmud contains extensive discussion of what occurs at the moment of death, with various Talmudic traditions describing the angel of death, the period of the soul's gradual separation from the body, and the subsequent journey of the soul toward judgment. Kabbalistic Jewish mysticism developed particularly elaborate frameworks for understanding the soul's experience after death. The Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah, composed in 13th century Spain, contains detailed accounts of what the soul encounters at death and during the period before the final resurrection. The doctrine of Gilgul, the transmigration of souls, was developed particularly through the Lurianic Kabbalah of the 16th century, with Isaac Luria of Safed teaching that souls return to the earth multiple times across multiple embodiments to complete the spiritual work that previous lives had left undone. Maimonides himself, the great 12th century Jewish philosopher and codifier of Jewish law, articulated 13 principles of Jewish faith that included the resurrection of the dead, establishing the teaching about resurrection and the world to come as foundational to traditional Jewish belief. The Egyptian tradition, though no longer practiced as a living religion, deserves attention because of the depth and sophistication of its engagement with what occurs at death. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, more accurately translated from the original Egyptian as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, presents a remarkably detailed cosmology of the soul's journey through the underworld after biological death. The deceased encounters Anubis, the jackal-headed god who guides souls through the underworld, and approaches the great judgment hall where the heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, truth. The judgment determines whether the soul proceeds to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise of eternal abundance, or is destroyed by Ammit, the devourer of unworthy hearts. The Egyptian cosmology was developed and refined across thousands of years of continuous civilization and influenced subsequent religious traditions, including aspects of Judaism, Christianity, and the Hellenistic mystery religions. The Greek tradition contributed its own elaborate cosmology of the soul's journey at death. Homer's Odyssey contains the visit of Odysseus to Hades, where he encounters the souls of deceased warriors and family members. Plato's Phaedo, composed in the early 4th century before the Common Era, presents Socrates' deathbed teaching on the immortality of the soul, with arguments that the soul pre-exists the body, persists beyond it, and continues through multiple embodiments. The myth of at the conclusion of Plato's Republic, provides his most detailed cosmology of the after-death state, describing how souls observe the lives available to them, deliberate about which to choose, and drink from the river Lethe before being reborn into new embodiments. The Eleusinian Mysteries, conducted at Eleusis near Athens for nearly 2,000 years until their suppression in the late 4th century, were held by ancient sources to provide initiates with experiences that fundamentally changed their relationship to death. Plutarch wrote that those who had been initiated into the mysteries no longer feared dying, having undergone in the rituals an experience that gave them direct knowledge of what awaited them. The specific contents of the rituals were protected by oaths of secrecy that participants maintained for the entirety of the tradition's existence. But the surviving testimony from initiates including Plato, Cicero, and others suggests that the rituals produced experiences with strong phenomenological similarities to what near-death patients now describe. The Greek mystery religions, particularly the Eleusinian and Orphic traditions, were specifically dedicated to the cultivation of preparation for the after-death experience. The Norse pre-Christian tradition preserved through the poetic and prose Eddas describes a complex cosmology of the soul's destinations after death. Warriors who died bravely in battle were believed to be taken to Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, where they would feast and prepare for the final battle of Ragnarok. Other deceased were taken to the realm of Hell or to the various other domains the cosmology recognized. The Norse framework contributed particular attention to the relationship between the moral quality of the embodied life and the state of the soul after death. The indigenous traditions across the world have developed their own frameworks for understanding what occurs at death. The Aboriginal Australian indigenous traditions speak of the soul returning at death to the ancestral realm of the dreaming, with the embodied life having been a temporary phenomenal expression of an eternal participation in that deeper reality. The Native American traditions across the entire continent contain accounts of the spirit road that the soul travels at death, with various tribal traditions preserving distinctive accounts of what the journey involves and what assistance the surviving community can provide. The Taoist tradition in China developed particularly detailed attention to the relationship between Hun and Po, two distinct aspects of consciousness that, on the traditional Taoist account, separate at the moment of biological death. The Hun, the more spiritual aspect, ascends and continues on, while the Po, the more bodily aspect, descends and dissolves. The Taoist alchemical tradition, particularly through the internal alchemy practices known as Naidan, was understood as systematic preparation for managing this separation in ways that supported the continuation of the more essential aspects of consciousness beyond biological death. The convergence across these independent traditions deserves substantial attention. Different cultures across the continent, working in different vocabularies and within different metaphysical frameworks, have arrived independently at recognizably similar accounts of what occurs at the threshold of biological death. The accounts share specific structural features: the separation of consciousness from the body, encounters with deceased relatives and other beings, perceptions of light or other intense phenomena, judgment or evaluation, decisions or movements toward subsequent states of being, features that appear too consistently across the traditions to be dismissed as mere cultural coincidence or shared psychological tendency. Something genuinely real is being recognized across these independent investigations that produces convergent descriptions despite the radically divergent methodologies, vocabularies, and theological starting points across the traditions. The convergence between these accumulated traditional accounts and the contemporary clinical research on near-death experiences makes the entire territory particularly significant for honest investigation. The contemplative traditions have been describing, for thousands of years before contemporary medicine existed, exactly the structural features that contemporary cardiac arrest patients are now reporting from clinical resuscitations in modern hospitals across the world. The patients have not typically studied the Bardo Thedol, the Catholic eschatological tradition, the Sufi accounts of the soul's journey, the Jewish teachings on the world to come, or any other developed traditional framework. The patients report experiences that align with these traditions because something consistent is being encountered, with the convergence reflecting access to actual features of the territory being investigated, rather than merely the projection of accumulated cultural expectations. The substantial depth and remarkable consistency of the traditional engagement with this territory provides additional reason to take the territory seriously, rather than dismissing it as superstition. The contemplative traditions across cultures have not been investigating some fringe phenomenon at the periphery of human concern. They have been engaging the question of what happens at biological death as central to their accumulated wisdom about the nature and meaning of human existence. Their detailed accounts deserve to be heard fully on their own terms, and the contemporary clinical research is now providing increasing empirical reasons to take them seriously, rather than dismissing them as primitive cultural projection or pre-scientific imagination. The integrated picture that emerges across these convergent traditions and the contemporary clinical research has substantial implications for how you should understand your own eventual biological death and the deaths of those you love. The work that follows turns to that fully integrated picture in detail, examining what the convergent accounts from all of the traditional and contemporary investigations together suggest about the nature of biological death and what continues, in some form, beyond it. The integrated picture that emerges across the entire territory we have been mapping is substantial enough to deserve careful summary before we now examine its full practical implications. Multiple independent lines of investigation, operating through entirely different methodologies and starting from entirely different theoretical and practical concerns, have converged on a structurally similar conclusion. The conclusion that emerges is not that any specific religious doctrine about the afterlife is correct in its full theological commitments. The conclusion that emerges is that the conventional materialist account of consciousness as something produced entirely by ongoing brain activity, with consciousness simply ceasing when brain activity ceases, does not adequately handle the substantial available evidence that has accumulated. Something genuinely more is occurring in this territory. Something continues to exist, in some form, beyond the cessation of ordinary brain activity, with the precise nature of what continues remaining contested across the various accounts, but with the basic structural prediction being well supported by multiple independent lines of investigation. The clinical research conducted over multiple decades has documented this beyond serious dispute. Pim van Lommel's groundbreaking prospective study of cardiac arrest survivors, published in the Lancet in December 2001, established empirically that approximately 18% of patients resuscitated from cardiac arrest report vivid, structured, and transformative experiences during the period of their documented clinical death. Sam Parnia's substantial AWARE studies have confirmed and extended these findings across more than 2,000 patients. Bruce Grayson's more than 50 years of careful research at the University of Virginia have documented the phenomenon across many thousands of cases, meeting careful diagnostic criteria. The well-documented Pam Reynolds case, the famous Maria tennis shoe case, the controversial Eben Alexander case, and many others include verifiable evidential elements that the patients could not have observed through any ordinary sensory channels during their periods of documented unconsciousness. The theoretical frameworks that handle this accumulated evidence include the filter theory developed across Bergson, James, and Huxley, and supported empirically by Robin Carhart Harris's psychedelic neuroimaging research at Imperial College London across the past decade. David Bohm's implicate order framework, drawing on his work in quantum mechanics, treats consciousness as actively participating in a unified, deeper reality from which both body and conscious experience unfold. The Penrose-Hameroff-Ochoa theory of consciousness proposes that quantum processes in cellular microtubules support conscious experience through mechanisms that may continue beyond the cessation of measurable classical neural activity. Amit Goswami's framework treats consciousness as fundamental rather than derivative, with the biological brain serving as a channel through which consciousness expresses itself, rather than as the producer of consciousness from nothing. The accumulated traditional accounts converge in genuinely remarkable detail. The Christian tradition's accumulated witness, from the Pauline experience in 2 Corinthians 12 through the Eastern Orthodox hesychast practice, through the Catholic mystical literature, describes specific encounter with divine reality at the threshold of death in ways that align consistently with what contemporary cardiac arrest patients now report. The Tibetan Buddhist Bardo Therdol presents a remarkably comprehensive map of the Bardo states encountered between embodiments whose specific features match in striking detail what contemporary near-death experience patients consistently describe. The Hindu Bhagavad Gita and Garuda Purana, the Islamic teachings on Barzakh and the Miraj, the Jewish teachings on Olam Haba and Gilgul, the Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day, the Greek mystery traditions, the Norse cosmology, the indigenous accounts across the continents, the Taoist Hunpo teachings, all converge on a recognizably similar structural picture of what occurs when biological death finally arrives at the threshold of each life. The remarkable convergence between these contemporary scientific findings and these accumulated traditional accounts across cultures is genuinely too consistent and too detailed in its features to be dismissed as mere coincidence or shared cultural mythology. Something genuinely real is being recognized across these radically independent investigations that produces consistently convergent descriptions despite the radically divergent methodologies and starting points. The integrated picture that emerges has substantial implications for how we should now understand biological death itself, the lives we are currently living, and how we should prepare for what awaits us at the eventual end of our embodied existence. This integrated picture faces serious objections that any honest engagement must address. We will examine the major objections first, then turn to the practical implications. The first major objection is the reductive materialist objection. The reductive materialist objection holds that all the apparent evidence for consciousness continuing beyond brain activity can be explained through conventional biological mechanisms once we understand those mechanisms more fully. The cardiac arrest reports reflect either residual brain activity that conventional measurement cannot detect, or confabulation occurring during the recovery period, rather than during the period of clinical death itself. The veridical perception cases reflect either undetected sensory access during the cardiac arrest or fortunate guessing combined with selective memory of accurate predictions. The cross-cultural convergence reflects shared features of how dying brains malfunction rather than access to any shared transcendent reality. On this account, the conventional production framework needs only to be developed further to accommodate all of the evidence, without requiring any framework that treats consciousness as fundamental or as continuing beyond brain activity. The reductive materialist objection deserves serious engagement, but it has accumulated substantial empirical difficulties as the empirical evidence has continued to accumulate over decades. The undetected residual neural activity hypothesis becomes substantially less plausible with each successive refinement of measurement techniques that detect activity below the threshold of older equipment without finding anything that approaches the complexity required to support the experiences patients report. The confabulation hypothesis cannot account for the verifiable details that patients sometimes report from their experiences, details that, in the strongest documented cases, were independently verified against medical records, surgical instruments, and conversations among staff that the unconscious patient could not have observed through normal channels. The cultural convergence hypothesis cannot explain the consistent reports from young children with limited cultural conditioning, or the visual perceptions reported by congenitally blind patients. The skeptical alternative explanations, taken individually or considered together as a cumulative framework, do not adequately handle the substantial accumulated empirical evidence. The second major objection is the insufficient evidence objection. The objection holds that even if the conventional alternatives have difficulties, the evidence for consciousness continuing beyond brain activity remains inconclusive. The strongest cases admit of alternative interpretations. The clinical research, while substantial, has not produced controlled experimental verification of the kind that would settle the question definitively. The various theoretical frameworks proposing consciousness as fundamental remain minority positions within mainstream neuroscience. On this skeptical view, the responsible position is to suspend judgment until more definitive empirical evidence becomes available through future research. This insufficient evidence objection has real force that deserves careful response. The frameworks we have considered are not the consensus positions within their respective fields. The evidence is suggestive rather than absolutely conclusive. Honest engagement with this territory requires acknowledging these epistemic limits openly. What the careful epistemological position does not require, however, is the suspension of all practical engagement until full certainty is achieved. Certainty about the deepest questions of consciousness may never be available within the methodological constraints that empirical science operates within. The contemplative traditions have been engaging these foundational questions through their own developed contemplative methodologies for thousands of years, producing convergent accounts that contemporary research is now beginning to align with. The integration of traditional insight with contemporary findings provides resources for orienting one's life that suspending judgment indefinitely simply does not provide. The third major objection is the materialist comfort objection. The objection holds that whatever the philosophical merits of the framework that has emerged, the human desire for continuation beyond death produces motivated reasoning that distorts the assessment of evidence. People want to believe that consciousness continues. They are inclined to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting their desired conclusion. The frameworks that emerge from this combination of evidence and desire reflect what people hope is true rather than what the evidence actually establishes. The materialist comfort objection deserves careful response. The motivated reasoning concern is genuinely real and applies to any investigation of contested fundamental questions. The proper corrective is not to dismiss reflexively any conclusion that might be motivated partly by hope, but to subject each emerging conclusion to careful, empirical, and theoretical scrutiny, while recognizing clearly that the desire for the conclusion does not by itself constitute evidence against the conclusion. The integrated frameworks that have emerged from this substantial investigation are not merely products of wishful thinking projected onto ambiguous data. They are direct responses to specific empirical findings that the conventional production account does not handle well at all. The contemplative traditions that have articulated these frameworks across thousands of years did not produce them merely from the human desire for continuation, but from sustained contemplative investigation that produced remarkably convergent accounts across cultures with very different theological commitments. The accumulated evidence across multiple independent lines, taken seriously on its own terms, substantially supports the basic structural prediction that consciousness is not exhausted by ongoing brain activity, regardless of whether anyone happens to hope that the prediction is true. The fourth and final major objection is the distressing experiences objection. Some documented near-death experiences are not blissful encounters with overwhelming light and love, but rather distressing encounters with darkness, void, or terrifying figures. The objection holds that the distressing experiences either undermine the framework that treats near-death experiences as access to a benevolent ultimate reality, or alternatively, suggest that the framework should embrace traditional notions of judgment and consequences that contemporary culture often resists. The honest engagement with distressing near-death experiences acknowledges both possibilities. The distressing phenomenon is documented in approximately 10 to 20% of cases, depending on how the distress is measured by researchers. Howard Storm's well-documented 1985 case provides a particularly clear example of this phenomenon. The documented presence of distressing experiences does not by itself overturn the framework, but it does suggest that the integrated picture is more nuanced than the most optimistic versions sometimes claim. Some contemplative traditions have specifically emphasized that the encounter at death depends substantially on the spiritual state of the consciousness that approaches it, with a prepared consciousness encountering different aspects than the unprepared. The contemporary distressing experiences are broadly consistent with this traditional teaching rather than fundamentally contradicting it. We have addressed the major objections. We can now turn to the practical implications of the integrated picture, which connects significantly with the broader investigation that previous explorations on this territory have built. The picture that emerges connects with the substantial framework that previous investigations have established. The time illusion investigation documented that time does not flow as ordinary experience suggests, but is a feature of consciousness traversing what is, on a deeper view, a unified four-dimensional structure. The near-death experience investigation extends this directly. The transition at biological death involves consciousness moving across what had appeared as a temporal boundary into the continuing structure beyond. The memory investigation documented that the past persists rather than disappearing, with sustained contemplative practice providing channels of access to what has been forgotten. The near-death experience investigation provides empirical support for that documentation through the life review phenomenon, in which patients consistently report reviewing their entire embodied life, with full vivid access to events long forgotten. The reincarnation investigation documented that consciousness may persist across embodiments. The near-death experience investigation provides additional support for that documentation through the convergent traditional accounts and through the contemporary research on cases like those of James Leininger and Ryan Hammonds that we have explored across these investigations. The prenatal consciousness investigation documented that consciousness exists in some form before biological birth. The near-death experience investigation completes the picture symmetrically. Consciousness exists before the body begins, operates through the body during the embodied life, and continues in some form after the body ends. The frequency investigation documented that consciousness operates through vibrational mechanisms, with sustained practices producing access to dimensions of reality that ordinary distracted living does not provide. The near-death experience investigation suggests that what becomes accessible at the moment of death is what those vibrational practices have been gradually approaching across embodied life, with the practitioner who has cultivated such access being prepared for what occurs naturally at biological death. The subconscious investigation documented the vast resources of awareness operating beneath the surface of ordinary cognition. The near-death experience investigation supports the conclusion that those subconscious resources include access to dimensions that the embodied consciousness normally filters out, with the filtering breaking down at the threshold of death. The cumulative integrated picture that emerges across all these prior investigations becomes substantial when assembled together. Reality is structured in ways that contemporary physics is documenting and that the contemplative traditions have been articulating for thousands of years. Consciousness operates through this physical structure, but is not entirely produced by it. The embodied life, between the threshold at which the body began and the threshold at which it will eventually fail, is one expression of something larger that exceeds the temporal and spatial boundaries of biological existence. The work of living well within this picture involves attending to what is here, while remembering, to whatever extent is possible, what is here from before and what will be hereafter. Now we can turn to the practical implications for ordinary life. 5 practical implications follow directly from the integrated picture, each addressing a particular dimension of how the framework that has emerged should affect how you live. The first major practical implication concerns the resolution of fear of biological death. Most people in modern cultures, shaped by materialist assumptions about consciousness, carry substantial unconscious fear about their eventual biological death, fear that what they have been throughout their lives will simply end, that everything they have ever loved will dissolve permanently into nothing, that the cessation of their embodied life is also the cessation of everything that has ever mattered to them. The integrated framework that has emerged across this investigation provides direct response to this fundamental fear. The careful integration of contemporary research and traditional wisdom suggests that this fear, while emotionally understandable, is not adequately supported by the evidence. The cessation of biological life is not, on the convergent, traditional and contemporary picture, the cessation of the consciousness that has been operating through that biological life. Something continues. The specific form of continuation remains contested, but the basic structural prediction that biological death is a transition rather than an extinction is supported by multiple independent lines of investigation and by accumulated traditional wisdom across cultures. The practical effect of taking this framework seriously can be substantial. The studies of near-death experience after effects have documented consistently that patients who have had these experiences report dramatically reduced fear of death across the rest of their embodied lives. They are not merely intellectually convinced that something continues. They have experienced something that produces lasting changes in how they relate to mortality. While most people in their ordinary lives do not have the kind of dramatic clinical experience that produces this transformation directly, the integrated picture that emerges from the broader investigation can produce a similar reorientation through careful study and reflection. Bruce Grayson's accumulated research at the University of Virginia has documented that even those who study near-death experiences carefully without having experienced one personally often report shifts in their orientation toward death, though the shifts are typically less dramatic than those experienced by patients themselves. Taking the convergent evidence seriously over time, allowing the implications to settle into your understanding, recognizing carefully that the materialist framework has substantial difficulties accommodating the accumulated available evidence. These are practical steps that can shift how you relate to your own eventual death and to the deaths and of those you love. The second practical implication concerns the experience of grief at the death of loved ones. The conventional materialist framework treats death as the absolute end of those who have died, with our continuing relationship to them being entirely a matter of memory and the lasting effects they had on us. The framework that has emerged suggests something different. The deceased have not simply ended. Something of who they were continues, in some form, with the relationship to them potentially continuing beyond the dissolution of their biological existence. The traditional practices of prayer for the dead, of communion with ancestors, or of cultivated relationship with those who have died, practices that exist across the major traditions in different forms, make sense within the framework that has emerged in ways that they do not within strict materialism. This does not require credulous acceptance of every claim about communication with the deceased. Many such contemporary claims are products of grief, psychological projection, or outright fraud. What the framework that has emerged does suggest is that the underlying relationship to those who have died is not necessarily ended permanently by their biological death, with the continuation of relationship through whatever form may turn out to be possible, being a real feature of the structure of reality rather than a sentimental fiction. The grief that follows the death of those we love remains real and substantial regardless of the metaphysical framework being applied. What changes within the integrated picture that has emerged is the basic understanding of what has actually occurred and what kind of continuing relationship may remain possible. The third, practical implication concerns the preparation for your own eventual death. The traditions across cultures have consistently taught that the moment of biological death is one of the most important transitions any human consciousness undertakes, and that the preparation for this transition involves the cultivation of qualities that the embodied life has the opportunity to develop. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition's elaborate practices for the moment of death, refined across more than 1,000 years, the Christian tradition's emphasis on memento mori, remember death, and on preparation for what was called a good death, the Islamic teaching that dying with the Shahada or another divine name on one's lips supports a favorable transition, the Sufi mystical practice of dying before you die, articulated by Rumi and others, all reflect frameworks in which the preparation for death is treated as an active spiritual practice rather than the passive waiting that contemporary materialist culture often suggests is appropriate. The framework that has emerged supports taking this preparation seriously. The accumulated contemporary research on transformed values following near-death experiences documents consistently that those who have experienced something at the threshold of biological death return with sustained changes in priorities, relationships, and orientation to life. The framework that has emerged across this investigation suggests that the preparation undertaken across embodied life, through committed contemplative practice, through sustained ethical cultivation, through engagement with what the traditions have refined across millennia, actually affects what occurs at the moment of biological death and what continues beyond it. The preparation undertaken is not merely a hedging of bets against the possibility that the traditions are correct. The preparation is the active cultivation of capacities that the embodied life specifically allows, capacities that the convergent evidence suggests will become operative at the threshold of biological death, whether or not the cultivator had anticipated them. The fourth practical implication concerns the careful assessment and possible reorientation of one's current embodied life. The life review phenomenon that near-death experience patients consistently report involves the experience of the entire embodied life from beginning to that moment being made present simultaneously, with full awareness of how each event affected the people around the patient. Patients across the accumulated research describe this as one of the most transformative aspects of their entire near-death experiences, recognizing in retrospect the actual meaning and consequences of choices that had seemed minor or merely routine at the time they were made. The implication for the embodied life is direct. If what awaits at the threshold of biological death is a comprehensive review of the entire life that has been lived, then the choices being made now, in your embodied life, are not merely matters of immediate preference, but contributions to what will eventually be reviewed at that threshold. This important implication does not require any punitive understanding of the life review phenomenon. The traditional accounts vary on whether the review is primarily evaluative, primarily educative, or primarily restorative. What the contemporary patients consistently report is that the review involves recognizing the actual effects of one's choices and actions on others, with the effects being experienced from the perspective of those who were affected by them, rather than merely from one's own original perspective at the time. The substantial implication is that ethical engagement during embodied life is not merely a social convention or a means to immediate satisfaction. Ethical engagement is, on this framework, the development of relationships and effects that constitute, in some genuinely real sense, what the embodied life will turn out to have been when the entire life is reviewed at the threshold of biological death. The hospice movement, founded by Cicely Saunders in the United Kingdom in the 1960s, has integrated traditional approaches to dying into contemporary medical care, with documented benefits for the dying and for their families, regardless of religious affiliation. The contemporary palliative care movement has built on this foundation, recognizing that the moment of death and the period leading up to it deserve attention beyond mere symptom management. The framework that has emerged supports the value of this attention, with the preparation for death being not merely psychological comfort, but engagement with what the convergent evidence suggests is a substantial transition. The fifth practical implication concerns the integration of contemplative practice into ordinary life. The contemplative traditions across cultures have refined practices specifically designed to cultivate the capacities that become important at the moment of death and beyond. Sustained meditation, contemplative prayer, mantra recitation, sacred study, ethical cultivation, and engagement with sacred community. These practices are not arbitrary cultural conventions inherited from less informed eras, but rather refined technologies of consciousness that produce specific effects that the framework that has emerged makes intelligible. The cultivation of stillness, the ability to remain present with awareness without grasping or aversion, the development of compassion that extends substantially beyond immediate self-interest, the gradual loosening of exclusive identification with the surface biographical self in favor of progressive recognition of something deeper that the surface expresses. These cultivated capacities have substantial relevance to what occurs at the threshold of biological death and beyond. The integration of contemplative practice into ordinary life does not require religious commitment in any particular tradition. Contemplative practices have been developed primarily within the major religious frameworks, but are accessible in modified secular forms to those who do not share the religious frameworks. Mindfulness meditation, derived from Theravada Buddhist sources, has been integrated into clinical contexts with substantially documented benefits regardless of the practitioner's metaphysical commitments. Contemplative prayer, derived from various Christian sources, particularly the centering prayer movement, has been practiced by people across the religious spectrum and even by those entirely beyond it. The practices have measurable effects that can be cultivated through committed engagement. The cultivation produces capacities that the integrated framework that has emerged suggests will be relevant when the biological body that has been carrying the practitioner finally fails permanently. We can now consider what all of this material means specifically for you, the person who has been encountering this material. You have been operating through a particular biological body for some specific period of years that constitutes your embodied life so far. That biological body had a specific beginning, somewhere in your past, that you cannot remember directly. That biological body will have an eventual ending, somewhere in your future, that you cannot precisely predict in advance. Between those two thresholds, the embodied life that is currently yours is actively unfolding through the daily choices you are making, the relationships you are cultivating, the work you are doing in the world, the qualities you are developing or failing to develop within yourself. The integrated framework that has emerged across this substantial investigation suggests strongly that this embodied existence is not the entirety of who you are. Something existed before this body began to develop, in some form that the various contemplative traditions have described differently, but that they converge in identifying as real. Something will continue when this body ends, in some specific form that the contemporary research and the traditional accounts together suggest is genuinely real, even if the precise nature of that continuation remains contested across the various accounts. The embodied life that is currently yours is one expression of something substantially larger that exceeds the temporal boundaries of biological existence. The choices that are being made during this embodied life are not merely consequential within the embodied existence itself. They contribute, in some real sense, to what you fundamentally are across the larger pattern of which the embodied life is one expression. This fundamental recognition has substantial practical consequences for how ordinary life is lived. The way you treat the people around you, including those closest to you, may look substantially different when you recognize that they too are something larger than their surface biographical narratives, with the relationships you build with them potentially continuing in some form beyond the eventual dissolution of the bodies through which those relationships have been operating during embodied life. The way you engage with your own difficulties and disappointments may look substantially different when you recognize that the embodied life is one chapter in a larger pattern with the meaning of any particular difficulty being determined by factors that extend substantially beyond the immediate situation. The way you face your own eventual death, when its time arrives, may be substantially different when you have come to understand death as a transition into something further rather than as the absolute extinction of who you have been. None of this requires acceptance of any specific religious doctrine in its full theological commitments. It requires only the basic recognition that the conventional materialist picture is inadequate to the available accumulated evidence, and that something substantially more is happening in the territory we have been mapping than that conventional picture allows. The recognition can be held with appropriate humility about the genuine limits of current knowledge, with continuing openness to whatever further empirical investigation may eventually reveal, and with practical orientation toward how the recognition should affect the actual embodied life that is currently being lived right now. The contemplative traditions have been telling humanity this story for thousands of years across multiple cultures that had no historical contact with each other. Contemporary clinical and theoretical research is beginning to suggest that the story is not merely cultural mythology, but is articulating something about the actual structure of reality and the deeper nature of consciousness. The story deserves to be heard fully on its own terms. The story deserves to shape how you actually live the embodied life that has been given to you between the threshold at which it began and the threshold at which it will eventually fail. Begin precisely where you currently are. If you have not yet engaged contemplative practice, begin some form of it now. Sit in deliberate silence for a few minutes each day, without device or distraction. Read sacred texts from a tradition that draws you naturally, attending to them carefully rather than merely skimming through them. Speak important words out loud with full awareness of what you are saying and why you are saying them. Build relationships with the people around you with careful attention to what those relationships actually are rather than merely to how they happen to serve you in the moment. These contemplative practices are not merely investments against an uncertain future after death. They are the active cultivation of the qualities that the framework that has emerged suggests will be operative when biological death arrives at its appointed time, with the cultivation itself producing substantial benefits during the embodied life that are completely independent of any specific predictions about what occurs after biological death. The deepest reality of who you fundamentally are exceeds the biological body that has been carrying you through the embodied life. The deepest reality has been with you all along, even when you forgot in the constant demands of ordinary distracted living that it was there with you. The threshold at which this body first began to develop was not the beginning of who you fundamentally are. The threshold at which this body will eventually fail will not be the absolute end of who you fundamentally are. The middle period, where you currently find yourself, is the time given to you for the particular expression of what you fundamentally are, with the ordinary biographical existence being one chapter in a much larger story whose other chapters extend in directions you cannot fully see from where you stand. Live this particular chapter well. Live it with the careful attention it actually deserves. Live it with the kind of seriousness that the territory we have been mapping suggests is genuinely appropriate. Live it with the deep recognition that you are not what you appear to be on the surface alone, that the surface biography is one expression of something deeper that exceeds it, and that the deeper something has been carrying you along all the way through the entirety of your embodied existence so far. When your time eventually arrives, the integrated framework that has emerged suggests that you will not simply end with the cessation of your biological body. Something will continue, in some form, that the various accounts have described differently. The contemplative traditions have offered detailed accounts of what that continuation involves and how to prepare for it. The contemporary clinical research is providing increasing empirical reasons to take those accounts seriously rather than dismissing them as pre-scientific imagination. You will encounter at the threshold of biological death what countless others have encountered before you, with the patterns of encounter being too consistent across cultures and across the entire body of contemporary clinical reports to be dismissed as merely cultural projection or imaginative fantasy. You came into this embodied life from somewhere that you cannot fully name in this current condition. You will eventually return to somewhere that you cannot fully imagine from where you currently stand. The middle, where you currently stand, is yours alone. Live it well, with all the seriousness it deserves. The walking is the actual work that needs doing. No one else can walk it for you. No teacher, however accomplished, however wise, can substitute for the personal engagement that you yourself must bring to the journey. The teachers can point toward what they have seen. They cannot do the walking for you. The walking is what produces, in real time, whatever you will eventually become, both in this embodied life and beyond its eventual dissolution. Walk well in this current embodied life. Walk with the kind of seriousness that this strange and brief embodied existence genuinely deserves. Walk with the humility that the genuine uncertainties of the spiritual journey appropriately require. Walk with the recognition that the contemplative traditions have left you maps refined across many thousands of years of careful and committed contemplative investigation by some of the most disciplined practitioners who have ever lived. Walk with the hope that the convergent witness across cultures and across the millennia of accumulated investigation provides. You are not merely what you appear to be on the surface alone. You are something substantially larger that has been operating through this particular biological body for the period of your embodied existence so far. When this body eventually fails permanently, what you fundamentally are will continue, in some form that you cannot fully imagine right now, but that the convergent evidence accumulated across multiple lines of investigation suggests is genuinely real. The substantive investigation that has been conducted across these pages closes here. The actual walking begins now, in your own ordinary life. Whatever you ultimately make of this territory, you alone are the one who can walk it for yourself. You came into this embodied life from somewhere that you cannot fully name in this current condition. You will eventually return to somewhere that you cannot fully imagine from where you currently stand. The middle period of the journey, where you currently find yourself, is genuinely yours. Live it well, with all the attention and care it deserves. Walk well in your time here. The eventual threshold awaits each of us in turn. You will meet it when its time finally arrives. The preparation for that threshold is happening right now, in the choices that are being made, the qualities that are being cultivated within yourself, and the engagement that is being undertaken with what the embodied life provides daily. Make the preparation worthy of what awaits at the end of this embodied chapter of your existence.